Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me for our latest episode of the Withstand podcast. As you may be aware, we're currently working through the Old Testament and New Testament in parallel. This episode will be focusing on the book of Genesis, chapter 11, and I do pray that it provides a little bit of calm against the backdrop of chaos that this world is currently going through, and of course God's truth against the backdrop of deception, which seems to be increasing as each hour passes at the moment. So I pray that this will bring you some sense of peace and, of course, clarity as well. So we are up to Genesis chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Salah. After he begot Salah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Salah lived 30 years and begot Eber. After he begot Eber, Salah lived 430 years and begot sons and daughters. Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg. After he begot Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and begot sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reu. After he begot Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and begot sons and daughters. Reu lived 32 years and begot Serug. After he begot Serug, Reu lived 207 years and begot sons and daughters. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. After he begot Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and begot sons and daughters. Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. After he begot Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot, and Haran died before his father Terah in his native land, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, she had no child. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abraham's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. This is the word of the Lord. Now, Dr. Thomas Constable's study notes actually contain quite a few visuals in this chapter, so I do encourage you to go back and read through those for context, and I'll leave the link to these notes in the show notes as well. So Dr. Thomas Constable writes, "This pericope is a flashback that explains the division of the earth in Peleg's time. In his days, the earth was divided. The main emphasis in this section is not the building of the Tower Babel, but the dispersion of the people. We can see this in the literary structure of the passage. Firstly, all the earth had one language. Secondly, they were there. Thirdly, they were one to another. And fourthly, come, let's make bricks. Then it goes on to say, let's make for ourselves a city and a tower. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the humans built. Come, let's confuse everyone the language of his neighbour. From there, confuse the language of the whole earth. And again, if you read through the table in the show notes, it'll make much more sense than me just reading it out here. He goes on to write, when the people of the world, united by a common language, attempted to preserve their unity and to make a name for themselves by building a tower that would reach into heaven, hoping to achieve godlike power and authority, Yahweh frustrated their plan and scattered everyone over the face of the whole earth by frustrating their ability to communicate in the language that bound them together. The Tower of Babel story is the last great judgment that befell mankind in primeval times. Its place and function in Genesis 1 to 11 may be compared to the fall in Genesis 3 and the Sons of God episode in Genesis 6, both of which triggered divine judgments of great and enduring consequence. This story explains to God's people how God scattered the nations and why. Sending judgment upon them for trying to establish a world order in opposition to divine rule or human government run amok, God struck the thing that bound people together, namely their common language. Chronologically, the Babel incident preceded the dispersal that Moses described with genealogies in chapter 10. By placing the Tower of Babel incident just prior to the patriarchal stories, the biblical writer is suggesting in the first place that post-flood humanity is as iniquitous as pre-flood humanity. Rather than sending something as devastating as a flood to annihilate mankind, however, God now places his hope in a covenant with Abraham as a powerful solution to humanity's sinfulness. Thus, problem and solution are brought into immediate juxtaposition, and the forcefulness of this structural move would have been lost had chapter 10 intervened between the two. As it is presently situated in the text, the account of the founding of Babylon falls at the end of a list of 14 names from the line of Joktan. At the end of the list of the 10 names of Peleg's line, however, is the account of the call of Abraham. So two great lines of the descendants of Shem divide in the two sons of Eber. One ends in Babylon, the other in the Promised Land. By placing the narrative between two genealogies of Shem, the author establishes a relationship between the central points of the narrative. Let us make a name for ourselves, and the central point of the patriarchal narratives. And God said, I will make your name great. Thus, the genealogies of Shem provide a narrative link between the story of the fall of Babylon and the account of the call of Abraham. One writer argued for the identification of the Tower of Babel incident with the demise and dispersion of the last great Sumerian dynasty centered at Ur. Although no record of the attempted building of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues has been found in cuneiform literature, a tradition of such an event was current outside of Israel and was ascribed by the transmitters of it to Babylonia. Some of the Hamites migrated east, specifically southeast, to the plain of Shinar. This was in the Mesopotamian basin, which is now modern Iraq. Some translations have them going from the east, for example, in the ESV and the New King James Version, which of course we've just read. But the Hebrew text reads literally, and he was as to move them to east, and they found. The Hebrews used the name Shinar, originally a region in northern Mesopotamia, to designate the whole region of Mesopotamia. In light of such intentional uses of the notion of eastward within the Genesis narratives, we can see that here too the author intentionally draws the story of the founding of Babylon into the larger scheme at work throughout the book. It is a scheme that contrasts God's way of blessing with man's own attempt to find the good. In the Genesis narratives, when man goes east, he leaves the land of blessing and goes to a land where the greatest of his hopes will turn to ruin. Following the Ararat departure, the people migrated southeast to the lower Euphrates Valley. Genesis 1 to 11 then has come full circle from Eden to Babel, both remembered for the expulsion of their residents. The motivation for building a city with its tower was to make the builders a name, to establish world domination, authority, and power in God's place. Ironically, history has not preserved the name of a single one of Babel's builders. Later, God would make a name for Abram. The object of this endeavour was evidently to establish a centre by which the builders might maintain their unity, achieve godlike authority, and gain world domination with a one world government. A defensive wall is a hallmark of a city. Cities in the ancient Near East were not designed to be lived in, but were intended for religious and public purposes. God desired unity for humankind, but one that he created, not one founded on a social state. The builders wanted to empower themselves. Both motive and object were ungodly. God had instructed man to fill the earth, to spread over the whole planet. The builders of the tower seem to have intended that it serve as a memorial or landmark, among other things. It was probably a ziggurat used for religious purposes. Mesopotamian religion claimed that their cities were of divine parentage. A symbol of this obsession with divinity among the Mesopotamians was the ziggurat that was erected as early as the 3rd millennium BC. The ziggurat was a step-ladder edifice made up of mud bricks, whose bottom was square or rectangular. The precise meaning of the structure is unknown, though it is widely agreed that it formed a stairway between the gods and earth. At the foot of the ziggurat, as well as a pinnacle, was a temple area serving as a habitation for the god. Ziggurats may have been considered an earthly imitation of the heavenly residence of the gods. A small pavement of rough limestone blocks at Uruk, also known as Erech and Walker on the Euphrates River, about midway between the ruins of Babylon and the Persian Gulf, is the oldest stone construction in Mesopotamia, and here too is found the first ziggurat. The Assyrian Babylonian and zikkuratu comes from the verb zakwari, meaning to be high or raised up, and hence signifies the top of a mountain or a stage tower. Such a tower provided a sort of artificial mountain in the flat Mesopotamian plain as a high place for a god, whose shrine stood on its summit. From its first appearance here at Uruk, it was ever afterward the most characteristic feature of temple architecture in Mesopotamia, and the locations of more than 24 such structures are known today. Mud brick with asphaltic tar, rather than stone and mortar, were the regular building materials of ancient Mesopotamia. The ziggurat, which stood at Babylon in the days of Hammurabi, and was known as Etepenaki, the house of the terraced platform of heaven and earth, became more famous than the ziggurat at Ur, and was remembered in biblical tradition as the Tower of Babel. But the ziggurat at Ur is today the best preserved of all monuments of this type, and therefore the best fitted to give a vivid impression of their character. Verse 4 identifies 2 basic errors of humankind: the determination to get to God by one's own works, rather than admitting that this is impossible, and trusting in God to make entrance into his presence possible. In short, salvation by works and the determination to glorify self rather than God. These errors have marked humankind throughout history. Don't we know it? Verses 5 to 6. The builders undoubtedly expected to ascend to heaven to meet God. Instead, God descended to earth to meet them. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower. Another anthropomorphism, here referring to God's omniscience and total knowledge. If God had allowed this project to continue, the results would have been even worse and more serious than they were at this time. The sin of the builders was that their refusal to obey God-given directives. Depraved humanity are united in their spiritual endeavour to find through technology existential meaning apart from God and the means to transgress its boundaries. Unless God intervenes and divides them by confounding their speech, nothing can stop human beings in their overweening pride and their desire for autonomy. The construction of cities by itself was not sinful. God chose Jerusalem for his people, and he will create the new Jerusalem for believers to inhabit. It is the pride and security that people place in their cities, and their arrogant independence from himself, the Most High God, that God disapproves of. Human beings must never forget that they are mortal, and that God is the Creator, whose position they should not try to usurp. God's words in chapter 11 have great relevance to the whole issue of cloning. While he encouraged us to advance our knowledge of the world he has created, we must not impinge on its prerogatives. The movement of humanity in our day is again, or still, to unite and so achieve security and independence apart from God. This will culminate, the book of Revelation reveals, in a one-world government under the leadership of Antichrist. The present breaking down of racial, linguistic, and geopolitical distinctions is evidence of this movement. From the human viewpoint, this unity seems good. But from divine perspective, it is further evidence of rebellion against God. He will judge it one day when Jesus Christ returns to the earth to terminate Antichrist and to rule for 1,000 years. God's soliloquy, "Come, let us go down," in this verse mimics the language of the tower builders in verse 4. The confusion of language probably involved more than just the introduction of new words, since the original single language produced the thousands that we have today. If language is the audible expression of emotions, conceptions, and thoughts of the mind, the cause of the confusion or division of the one human language into different national dialects might be sought in an effect produced upon the human mind, but which the original unity of emotion, conception, thought, and will was broken up. This inward unity had no doubt been already disturbed by sin, but the disturbance had not yet amounted to a perfect breach. Some scholars believe that this judgment resulted in ethnic and racial distinctions in humankind eventually. They believe that the Table of Nations in chapter 10 may also imply this. The resultant confusion led to a scattering of the people over the face of all the earth. God did not allow human rebellion to reach the level that it did before the flood. He forced people to do what they refused to do voluntarily, namely scatter over the face of the earth. This is the third great judgment on sinful humanity in this first major section of Genesis, the first two being Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden, and the second being the flood. They deserve death, but are only banished or transported, for the patience of God is very great towards a provoking world. And they're referring to the rebellious builders here. Some interpreters take the confusion of languages to have been a local phenomenon only. One writer believed that lightning struck the Tower of Babel, and the confusion of speech that followed resulted from a scrambling of the electrical circuits in the brains of those struck. This is an interesting idea, but impossible to prove or disprove. Most interpreters, however, regard this event as the source of the major language groups in the world today. It should be observed that the change of speech is not asserted to have been sudden, though it may have been. Much less is it asserted that all differences observable in languages the world over, or even those characteristic differences which distinguish the great families of language, owe their origin to the confusion at Babel. The event at Babel must not be minimized, neither must it be exaggerated. Babel sounds like the Hebrew word for confuse, and it means the gate of gods in Akkadian. Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel story, is a satire on the claims of Babylon to be the centre of civilization and its temple tower the gate of heaven. Babel does not mean gate of God, but confusion and folly. Far from its temples, top reaching up to heaven, it is so low that God has to descend from heaven just to see it. This was the original Babylon, the Greek form of the name Babel, that forever afterward was the city most characterized in the Bible by rebellion against God's authority and the desire to earn salvation by works, idolatry, and self-assertion. It stands as a symbol of organized rebellion against God elsewhere in Scripture, and God will eventually destroy it. The spirit of Babel is strong throughout the world today. Man certainly did not expect his project to take such a turn. He did not anticipate that the name he wanted to make for himself would refer to a place of non-communication. The story of Babel is important for several reasons. Firstly, it explains the beginning of and the reason for the various languages of humankind. It also probably explains the origin of the races within humankind. The separate language groups no longer could intermarry freely with the rest of mankind. As inbreeding and lack of access to the larger pool of genes occurred, ethnic characteristics developed. Furthermore, each local environment tended to favour a selection of certain traits and eliminate the others. Ethnic characteristics such as skin colour arose from loss of genetic variability, not from origin of new genes through mutation as suggested by evolution. The concept of race is an evolutionary idea. All humans possess the same colour, just different amounts of it. We all descended from Noah and Adam. The Bible doesn't tell us what skin colour our first parents had, but from a design point of view, the middle colour makes a great beginning. Starting with the medium-skinned parents, it would take only one generation to produce all the variation we see in human skin colour today. In fact, this is the normal situation in India today. Some Indians are as dark as the darkest Africans, and some, perhaps a brother or sister in the same family, as light as the lightest Europeans. I once knew, that is Dr Constable, he knew a family from India that included members with every major skin colour you could see anywhere in the world. But now notice what happens if human groups were isolated after creation. If those with very dark skins migrate into the same areas and or marry only those with very dark skins, then all their children will have very dark skins. AABB is the only possible combination of AB, egg and sperm cells, which are the only types that can be produced by AABB parents. Similarly, parents with very light skins can have only very light-skinned children, since they don't have any dominant A or B genes to pass on. If you're keeping up with this, you're doing very well. It's probably best to see this on screen or in the PDFs, guys. Even certain medium-skinned parents can get locked into having only medium-skinned children, like the Orientals, Polynesians, and some of my ancestors, the Native Americans. Where people with different skin colour get together again, as they do in the West Indies, for example, you find the full range of variation again, nothing less but nothing more either than what we started with. Clearly all this is variation within kind. What happened as the descendants of medium-skinned parents produced a variety of descendants? Evolution? Not at all. Except for albinism, the mutational loss of skin colour, the human gene pool is no bigger and no different now than the gene pool present at creation. As people multiplied, the genetic variability built right into the first created human beings came to visible expression. The darkest Nigerian and the lightest Norwegian, the tallest Watusi and the shortest Pygmy, the highest soprano and the lowest bass could have been present right from the beginning in two quite average-looking people. Great variation in size, colour, form, function, etc. would also be present in the two created ancestors of all the other kinds of plants and animals as well. Evolutionists assume that all life started from one or a few chemically evolved life forms with an extremely small gene pool. For evolutionists, enlargement of the gene pool by selection of random mutations is a slow, tedious process that burdens each type with a genetic load of harmful mutations and evolutionary leftovers. Creationists assume each created kind began with a large gene pool, designed to multiply and fill the earth with all its tremendous ecologic and geographic variety. Many thinkers labour under the illusion that evolution is an empirical science when in fact is a philosophy. We can never have too big a conception of God, and the more scientific knowledge in whatever field advances, the greater becomes our idea of his vast and complicated wisdom. The Babel story demonstrates the inclination of fallen man to rebel against God and try to provide for his needs in his own way rather than by trusting and obeying God. It also illustrates that rebellion against God results in broken fellowship between God and man and failure to realize God's intention for man in his creation, namely that he rule the earth effectively. Additionally, it provides a historical background for what follows in Genesis, since Abraham, the great patriarch and father of the Hebrews, came from Mesopotamia. Irony is seen in the beginning and the ending of this passage. The group at Babel began as the whole earth, but now they were spread over the whole earth. By this time the lesson is clarified. God's purpose will be accomplished in spite of the arrogance and defiance of man's own purposes. He brings down the proud, but exalts the faithful. The significance of this little story is great. It explains to God's people how the nations were scattered abroad, yet the import goes much deeper. The fact that it was Babylon, the beginning of kingdoms under Nimrod from Cush, adds a rather ominous warning. Great nations cannot defy God and long survive. The new nation of Israel need only survey the many nations around her to perceive that God disperses and curses the rebellious, bringing utter confusion and antagonism among them. If Israel would obey and submit to God's will, then she would be the source of blessing to the world. Unfortunately, Israel also raised her head in pride and refused to obey the Lord God. Thus she too was scattered across the face of the earth. So what became of Shem? The function of this genealogy is not so much to connect Abraham with the preceding events, as the previous genealogies have done, but to provide the reader with the necessary background for understanding the events in the life of Abraham. The list includes 8 names. All the individuals named are relevant for understanding the events of the following narrative except Iscah. The inclusion of this otherwise insignificant name in the list suggests that the author is seeking to achieve a specific number of names. Thus far in the book of Genesis, the author has followed a pattern of listing 10 names between important individuals in the narrative. In this short list, only 8 names are given. Hence, if we are expecting 10 names, the number of individuals in this list appears to be short by 2 names. By listing only 8 names, the author leaves the reader uncertain who the 9th, and more importantly, the 10th name will be. It is only as the narrative unfolds that the 9th and 10th names are shown to be the 2 sons of Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac. The Babel account is not the end of early Genesis. If it were, the story would conclude on the sad note of human failure. But, as with earlier events in Genesis, God's grace once again supersedes human sin, ensuring the continued possibilities of the promissory blessings. The scaffolding of human pride would be dismantled by the erection of the Shemite line that culminates in obedient Abraham, who likewise is found in the region of Shinar. Abraham would prove to be the nation's deliverance. Without the blessing of God, the situation of humanity is without hope. That seems to be the chief thrust of the opening chapters of Genesis. In contrast to the genealogy in chapter 5, this one emphasizes life and expansion rather than death, even though longevity was declining. This genealogy starts with Noah's son Shem, whom God blessed, and it concludes with Abram, whom God purposed to bless. This is a line of Israel's ancestors. It is a vertical list of the type used in the ancient Near East to document legitimate claims to thrones or inheritances. This genealogy, like the one in chapter 5, appears to be complete, but since other biblical genealogies have gaps in their lists, we may be suspicious that this one may have gaps as well. Note that the pattern Moses followed in this list is X lived so many years and begat Y, and X lived so many more years and begat other children. This is the same pattern we find in chapter 5, except that there the final notation is X lived a total of so many years and died. The purpose of this genealogy in chapter 11 is to connect Abram to Noah and to give background information essential for understanding the story of Abram that follows. The author's aim is to show that God's promise concerning the seed of the woman cannot be thwarted by the confusion and scattering of the nations at Babylon. If the message of Genesis is essentially one of redemption, Genesis 3 to 11 explains why man needs salvation and what he needs to be saved from. Chapters 1 to 2, in describing the original state of the world, also describe the goal of redemption, to which ultimately the world and humanity will return when the patriarchal promises are completely fulfilled. An extensive statistical analysis of the lifespans of the patriarchs, as given in Genesis chapter 5 and 11, shows that statistically the lifespan can be considered constant before the flood, while after the flood the data can be fitted by an asymptotic exponential decay curve. Also, it is concluded that as for the lifespans reported in Genesis chapter 11, the data in the Masoretic text are the authentic ones. Those in the Septuagint, have been tampered with. Moreover, it is statistically unlikely that there are gaps in the genealogies in Genesis chapter 11. The genealogies in chapter 11 through 26 and 1 Chronicles chapter 1 through 27 are identical, but the one in Luke chapter 3 through 36 inserts the name Canaan between Arphaxad and Shelah. The inclusion of Canaan may indicate that Luke uses a Septuagint to compose his genealogy, since this name appears in this Greek translation, but not in the Masoretic genealogies. Canaan appears elsewhere in Luke's list as Adam's great-grandson, so this may be a scribal error. Adam, Noah, and Abram all fathered 3 named sons, linking them as saviours of humanity. In Abram's case, these sons or descendants were Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The genealogy of Shem in this pericope prefaces the story of Abram. This structure serves as a prototype, first example, for the narrative that follows in Genesis. Similarly, the genealogy of Ishmael introduces the story of Jacob and Esau, and the genealogy of Esau introduces the story of Joseph. With the scene in chapter 11 has finally been set for the patriarchal history to unfold, the opening chapters of Genesis have provided us with fundamental insights for interpreting these chapters properly. Genesis 1 revealed the character of God and the nature of the world man finds himself in. Genesis 2 and 3 portrayed the relationship between man and woman and the effect man's disobedience has had on man-woman and divine human relations. Chapter 5 sketched the long years that passed before the crisis of the great floods, which almost destroyed all humanity for its sinfulness. The Table of the Nations started the process of Israel's geographical and political self-definition with respect to the other nations in the world. But Genesis 11 reminds us that the nations were in confusion and that mankind's proudest achievements were but folly in God's sight and under his judgment. However, according to chapter 11, just 5 generations after Peleg, whose lifetime, according to chapter 10, saw the confusion of languages at Babel, Abram arrives, as chapter 12 will declare. It is through him that all the families of the earth will be blessed. Man is not without hope. The brevity of this genealogy is a reminder that God's grace constantly exceeds his wrath. He may punish to the 3rd or 4th generation, but he shows mercy to thousands. 4 key concepts presented in Genesis 1 through 11 are crucial for comprehending the rest of the Bible. First, the God who entered the lives of Abram and Sarai is the same God who created the entire universe. He is the only true and living God, Yahweh, the creator and the savior of the world. Second, all people have rebelled against God, their benevolent creator, and his goodwill for them. Humanity has inherited a state of sinfulness from Adam and Eve's rebellion in the Garden of Eden. Third, God judges and will judge the actions of all people. God, by sending the flood, made it clear to Noah and to everyone that human wickedness is entirely unacceptable. God cannot let evil reign free in his creation. Fourth, sin continues to plague all of humanity, even after the flood. Although the flood did not wash away sin, God, as the second half of Genesis has a plan to save humanity from its own evil deeds. The chronological framework for the patriarchal stories, that is Abraham through Joseph, rests on 2 important texts, both 1 Kings chapter 6 and Exodus chapter 12. From these 2 texts we can calculate other dates in the patriarchal period. The historicity of the patriarchs continues to be a matter of scholarly debate. The problem is the lack of explicit reference to the patriarchs in non-biblical literature and in archaeology. The scientific study of the material remains of the past. Scholars who reject the biblical testimony as unauthentic have been labelled minimalists, and those who believe that the Hebrew Bible credibly supplements non-biblical materials are known as maximalists. I am one of the latter, believing that the biblical records reliably testify to historical individuals and events recorded in this section of Genesis. One liberal scholar made the following admission: it is not because scholars of today begin with more conservative presuppositions than their predecessors that they have a much greater respect for the patriarchal stories than was formerly common, but because the evidence warrants it. It is beyond question that traditional and conservative views of biblical history, especially of the patriarchal period, will continue to be favoured by whatever results accrue from ongoing EBLA research. And then it goes through the genealogy in the tables here, and that's worth having a look at your leisure as well. And then it goes into the patriarchal narratives as well. There's quite a few pages on that. And then it starts to talk through what became of Terah as well. So I'll leave the link to the notes in the show notes so that you can read through that at your leisure. And hopefully that will also be a blessing to you. And I, of course, will read through those in parallel as well. Now, guys, please forgive me for cutting those readings short. I'm just very conscious that Dr. Constable must have put in a huge amount of work into those study notes for each and every chapter and verse. And I just don't want to do it justice by reading through it quickly just to get through to the end. So that's why I keep the link in the show notes for you so you can read them at your own leisure and really pause and reflect as you work your way through. And so what I might do with those sort of meatier passages is just read through, say, a third or a half of those notes and then leave you to read it through the rest in your own time. Now, today's daily devotion from Charles Stanley is called The Blessing of Relationship, and it's based on Genesis 2. The Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him." When God created the world, he saw that each thing he'd made was good. In fact, the first time he declared that something wasn't good was when he saw that Adam was alone. This is a principle of the Christian life. It's not good when you isolate yourself from others. The Lord's desire is not only that you have an intimate relationship with Him, but also that you have edifying relationships with other believers. This is why when you're lonely, you're instructed first to seek the Lord and then also turn to friends and loved ones. In fact, one of God's great blessings in life is godly friends. This is especially true in times of intense grief and heartbreaking loss. Friends can comfort you, give you godly counsel, and help you heal. In other words, loneliness is remedied by interaction and involvement with the Lord and with others, not by withdrawal into fantasy, entertainment, drugs, or other escapist activities. So when you're lonely, don't turn to things that can satisfy. Go to God or to someone who He has given you to love and find what you really need. Jesus, help me grow closer to you and those you've given me to love. Amen. Don't know about you, but I can certainly relate to that daily devotion today, particularly as I continue my grieving for both my dad and my mum. I do know that I tend to isolate myself a bit, so I pray that you, depending on where you're at in your life, that you're surrounded by godly friends and family, and I will try to make a concerted effort to reach out to those godly people around me, and I know there's at least a handful of people out there that I can be reaching out to, and that'll be my challenge for the coming days. Until next time, guys, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and God bless you all. And as always, Maranatha. See you soon, guys.